whether you know it or not. Thanksgiving was last Thursday, and Advent actually doesn't start until next week. So, what do we do with the worship time when we are done giving thanks and we're not yet ready to celebrate and anticipate Christ in our lives? The only thing that I can think of is that we are in a between time. We are between this and that. We are between yesterday and tomorrow, between now and then. Friends, right now, we're in limbo. So what do you do when you find yourself in the time of limbo? Well, we think. We contemplate, we reflect, we ponder, we consider, we ruminate, we meditate. And that is exactly what we're going to do today. This week gives us the perfect time to think about who we are as we go into the Advent season. Our scripture today comes from 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 1 through 7. It is the last words of King David. Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David, son of Jesse, the oracle of the man whom God exalted, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the favorite of the strong one of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks through me. His word is upon my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The rock of Israel has said to me, one who rules over people justly, ruling in fear of God, is like the light of morning, like the sun rising on a cloudless morning, gleaming from the rain on the grassy land. Is not my house like this with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. Will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? But the godless are like thorns that are thrown away, for they cannot be picked up with a hand. To touch them, one uses an iron bar or the shaft of a spear, and they are entirely consumed in fire on the spot. As death approached, David reflected on his long, complex life. He had been a shepherd boy, a warrior, a commanding general, king, and singer of psalms. He now gives voice to his belief that what had sustained him through the years of triumph and tragedy, sanctity and sin, was God, his rock, who kept his promise to be with him. David could now lie down and rest, assured that God would continue to be with those who would come after him. I have a question for you. What is this house built of? Anybody? What's wood? Bricks. Wood, bricks, windows, metal, shingles, doorknobs, hinges. Those are all materials that are necessary. But even more important are the people who live inside. When King David of Israel described his house, he was talking about his family. David saw how important it was to let God speak through him, with words that were honest and loving. His house was strong because he treated people fairly. And David felt it important that his family have a relationship with God that would last forever. strong. I want us to look at family this week. What does it mean to be family? How do we define family? And what does family look like? I think here at New Song, we define family differently than some churches might. And I don't do this very often, but today I'm going to speak for the other pastoral staff here as well as the congregation. Family for us here is not necessarily a mom and a dad and 2.5 children. Family here can be 2 dads, 2 moms, 1 of each, 1 child, no children, 5 children. It can also mean a single person in relationship with all others here in this faith community. Like King David, family is those gathered in the presence of God who love and respect one another. The stories that we share during the holiday season are meant to communicate past experiences. The truth is that everyone has a story. And the more we are able to connect our story with the stories of others, the more we see ourselves in a different light. Capturing our stories and sharing them isn't just a way of leaving a legacy for those left behind, but of opening a door to a future that is filled with hope, not only for us, but for all who speak with us. All who will relate to both our pain and our triumph. We might think of this week's text as a kind of closing statement of David's own story uttered at the end of an epic and tragic life. David's story is a tale of an unlikely hero who was chosen by God, even though he was the least qualified in his family and his tribe. He slays a giant by demonstrating faith in God and bravery beyond his years. He goes from herding sheep in the countryside to being the most popular person in the court of the king. David becomes king and is a man after God's own heart. But the higher we climb, the further we tend to fall. David engages in an adulterous affair, kills off the woman's husband, loses the child, and then will lose the whole next generation of his children, except for one. It's a classic story of the heights and the depths of human experience, the sinister power of sin, and the corruption that often accompanies power. David's last words are written in an oracle that puts David in the company of the prophets. God speaks through David and says, "One who rules over people justly, ruling in the fear of God, is like the light of the morning, like the sun rising on a cloudless morning, gleaming from the rain on the grassy land." David's song here is really less autobiographical of the past than it is of hopeful in the future. Even with all of David's brokenness revealed again and again in the story, the promise of God will still be realized through his royal line. God is faithful to his promises, even when we are unfaithful. David says as much in the midst of our text today. God has made a covenant with David despite the king's failure to live up to his end of the covenant. God's promises are always ordered in all things and secure. No matter what the godless do. And if we're all honest and in our relationships or in our own assessment of our lives, at some point, we are all godless. God will stick to his story of redemption in the world. That's an important reality to remember as we tell our stories. Sure, there are lots of things that you will want to include in your own story. Things like places, important dates, impressions of people and events, your feelings about how things happened over your course of life. It's a real temptation to offer only the edited version of your own story. That version that puts us all in a good light. But even those of us that preach on Sunday morning know that people will turn you off if you are always the hero in your own story. God is the only hero that we require, that we need. We need to always remember that our lives, our life stories only have lasting value if they're folded into the story of what God has been doing, is doing, and will do in the world. David looked back at his life loaded with both power and pain and said essentially, no matter what, God will put things right. Our story is part of God's story and should focus as much on the future as on the past. Stories remind us that we all have a past and that we have been shaped by the events and the people that we've known over the years. Stories remind us, too, that we are all broken people who are prone to big mistakes, regrets, detours that have led us in directions we never would have thought of. An epic story will speak the truth about us. Otherwise, it would be pretty self-serving and boring to the real world. After all, who wants to hear about someone who's perfect? Unless, of course, that someone is Jesus. So what's your story? A number of years ago, I came across a book that I bought for Ed, my husband, and it simply is A Father's Legacy. And within this book, and I promised him I wouldn't share anything in here, within this book, it asks questions, and then it gives you a place where you can reflect on that question. And just some of the things that are in here. Has there been an event in your marriage when sharing and partnership were particularly important? Describe an especially memorable Christmas gift you received. There's questions in here about your closest friends, leisure activities. When did you start to think about having children? The book has wonderful prompts to get you thinking about your story. What scientific discoveries or advances have interested you the most? In what ways do you think society has changed since your youth? It's a book that helps begin to tell your story. What does your story look like so far? What are the events in your life that have shaped your attitudes, informed your understanding of the world, or changed your direction? Would you make a list of significant places that are a part of your life's geographical story? What are those places, and why are they important to you? What advice would you give to others? Would you try to answer the question, if I had to do it all over again? But even more than that, where is God in your story? Were there times when you thought God had gone AOL, had left? Your life story may fall into categories of the hero journey, followed by your coronation as king or queen. Would your journey talk about a quest for wealth, love, peace, or justice? Beginning next Sunday, we are going to look into the lives of Mary and Joseph and the shepherds. We will see how in present-day time, God is working in their lives. Can you imagine what story Mary would tell if she were sitting around the table with the family and friends sharing stories while lighting the Advent candles? Imagine that she shares about how her son was conceived. If you were Joseph, how much of the story would you tell others? Can you tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth? By our own efforts, our houses can never be the source of light in the world. David's example here urges us boldly to claim God's promise as the basis for our own efforts to rule justly and bring light. Our own efforts by themselves will, as with David, fall short. But our bold claim to the trustworthiness of God's promise will give us hope beyond the realistic prospects of human possibilities. David also wrote perhaps the most famous poem in history. We call it the 23rd Psalm. And at the end, he predicts how his own story will end. It can also be the way our story can find its most wonderful conclusion. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. In the between time, let us focus on family and the stories that we will be sharing and the new stories that will begin in our families. Amen.